Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video I'm going to be talking about harmonic progression, or how you know which chords can precede or follow other chords. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then this is the video for you. But before you watch this video, you should definitely check out my video on the diatonic triads in the major and minor modes. I'll be referring to the chords in this video by the Roman numeral system that I introduce in that video. So in order to understand what I'm talking about, you should watch that one first. Harmonic progression is the system in tonal music that tells you what chords can precede or follow other chords. In tonal music, every chord has a job to do, and we can organize the chords around the jobs that they typically do in any particular key. I'll show you how that works first in the major mode and then in the minor mode. Let's start by talking about the harmonic functions. There are three of them. We have tonic function chords, predominant function chords, and dominant function chords. In most tonal music, music progresses by starting on a tonic function, moves through a predominant function, to a dominant function, which finally ends on a tonic function. What's really kind of cool about this system is this tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression can happen on multiple levels in a piece of music. So within an entire piece, we might have one tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic that underlies the whole structure. And then on top of that, on a more local level, you might have several other tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progressions which help to prolong the overall progression that underlies the whole piece. I'll explain exactly how that works in later videos. For now, it's enough to understand the basics of the system. So we're going to start at the end of this progression, which is the final tonic. Most tonal music ends on a tonic chord. In this case, we're going to call this our tonic. If we back up one chord, we typically will precede the tonic with a dominant chord. We can think of it as a 5-to-1, which is sort of the most common type of progression that we have in music. And it sounds like this. If we back up again, one more chord into the predominant area, the most common predominant is typically the subdominant chord or the 4 chord. So a very typical harmonic progression will go from 4 to 5 to 1 and sounds like this. You can hear the finality in that cadence or that arrival on the final tonic. Now some people believe that the real primary predominant chord is not the 4 chord at all, but the 2 chord, and we'll typically hear this more commonly in jazz or commercial progressions. And it sounds very similar to the 4-5-1 progression, with just a little bit of a different flavor on the predominant area. And that sounds like this. We typically precede the predominant with a tonic chord. So the entire tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression might sound something like this. 1 to 4 to 5 to 1 is what we typically call the primary triads in the tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression. Within this system, we have several opportunities for substitution. So when we have a dominant chord, dominant chords you can think of as being like a musical promise. As soon as you write one, there are very limited places that you can resolve. Typically, dominant chords resolve to tonics. But on some occasions, the dominant chord can resolve instead to the submediant or the 6th chord. So if I play my entire TPDT progression, substituting a 6 chord for the final 1 chord, it sounds like this. It doesn't have as final of a sound. In fact, that 6 chord kind of propels us to have to do some more chords before we arrive at the final tonic. We'll explore how that works later. When the 5 chord resolves to the 6 chord, we call that a deceptive resolution. The tonic chord is the expected chord, and we're deceived by substituting a submediant chord instead. We can do a substitution in the dominant area also. Instead of using a dominant chord, a 5 chord, we can substitute a 7 chord instead. And that sounds like this. Notice how it has a very similar sound to the dominant chord that it replaces. Now, why can we do this? Well, if we take a look at the structure of a dominant chord and we add a 7th to it, typically adding a 7th to a triad doesn't change its function, it changes its sound a little bit and its desire towards resolution. So now, as you'll see, we have this dominant 7th, and if I were to remove the root of that chord, what I have left is the leading tone triad, or the 7 chord. So we can think of the leading tone triad, the 7 chord, as being the same as a dominant 7th chord that's missing its root. Therefore, it's going to have the same sound and same function as that dominant 7th chord. There are substitutions that can take place in the predominant area as well, and we've already seen one of those. Earlier on in this video, I talked about how some people believe the 2 chord is actually the primary predominant instead of the 4 chord. And it really depends on what you think the role of the predominant is. If the role of the predominant is to prepare the dominant, then the root motion of a 5th from 2 to 5 to 1 is a stronger root motion than the root motion of a 2nd from 4 to 5 to 1. If, however, you think the predominant area's primary role is to get away from tonic, the progression from 1 to 4 down a 5th is a much stronger root motion than the progression from 1 to 2 up a 2nd. So in a sense, we can think of the predominant area as being both predominant and post-tonic. Now, why else can a 4 chord and a 2 chord substitute for each other? Well, it's the same reason that we can substitute a 7 chord for a 5 chord. A 4 chord can easily be thought of as a 2/7 chord that's simply missing its root. So the entire progression from 1 to 2 to 5 to 1 sounds like this. We can also include the submediant triad, or the 6 chord, in the predominant area. And I hope you're seeing that there's something that all the predominant chords have in common, and there's something that all the dominant chords have in common. The predominant chords all contain scale degree 6, and the dominant chords all contain scale degree 7, which want to resolve to the tonic function chords, which all contain scale degree 1. So on a linear basis, a melodic basis, we can think of the TPDT progression as consisting of a series of progressions, a series of melodic lines that go 6, 7, 1. So if I substitute the 6 chord in the predominant area, it sounds like this. That gives us an interesting opportunity here. You'll notice that 6 now shows up in 2 places in my TPDT chart. It shows up in the tonic area at the end of the progression as part of the deceptive resolution, and it shows up in the predominant area. What that means is if I were to deceptively resolve from my dominant to the submediant from a 5 chord to a 6 chord, I can then jump to the other location where the 6 chord exists in my chart and then continue the progression on from there. So the typical way it might play itself out might be something like this. I start on a 1 chord, I'll go to the 4 chord, I'll then go to the 5 chord, and then I'll do the Deceptive Resolution to the 6 chord, which then takes me back to the predominant area, in which case I can then go back to a 5 chord, and then back home to a 1 chord. So it allows me to lengthen the progression beyond just one cycle of TPDT. I'm essentially going TPDT, but my final T is also a chord that shows up in the P area, which allows me to append another PDT on the end. So now our chart looks like this. Now within each harmonic function area, I can move between the chords as long as I'm moving down or down by third. I typically don't move up, say from a 5 to a 7 or a 2 to a 4, because then it doesn't really sound like the chords are progressing. It sounds like we're just changing colors of the same chord that we just played. So the way this works is I can start on a tonic chord, and then maybe I'll go to a 6 chord, a submediant. I'm now in the predominant area, and if I'm not ready to go to the dominant area yet, I can go to perhaps my subdominant, the 4 chord. And then if I'm still not ready to go to the dominant yet, I can go even farther towards the 2 chord. And then I can go to my 5 chord, and then home to my 1 chord. I don't have to include all of those chords in the predominant area. I could simply go from 1 to 4, to 2, to 5, and then back to 1. As long as I'm moving down through my chart rather than up, I should be okay. Likewise, I could do the same thing with the dominant area. So if I do my tonic, and I'll just go to a 4 predominant, I can then go to a 7 dominant, and then convert that to a 5, which then takes me home to my tonic. So there are lots of ways I can now move through this chart. Now you've probably noticed that this accounts for all of our triads in the major mode except for one, the mediant triad, the 3 chord. The 3 chord is kind of an oddity. It really doesn't sit well in the TPDT harmonic progression model. It kind of acts as a tonic, but it doesn't have scale degree 1 in it, so it's a very unsatisfying tonic. Typically, a 3 chord will move on to a 6 chord, and it will most commonly be preceded by the 7 chord. The most common presentation would be in what we call the circle of fifths progression, which goes from tonic, subdominant, leading tone, mediant, submediant, supertonic, dominant, tonic. In fact, I even go so far when teaching harmony classes to prohibit my students from using mediant triads, 3 chords, unless they're using it in the context of a circle of fifths progression. Later on, when they're working on creativity exercises, instead of just craftsmanship exercises, they can use the mediant triad a lot more. But for right now, because the chord is so rare, and because it really only typically functions as part of the circle of fifths progression, it's best to avoid it unless you are consciously writing that progression. The system for the minor mode works very much like the system for the major mode. In fact, you're going to notice a lot of similarities. The Roman numerals basically behave the same way. They carry the same harmonic functions. The qualities will change based on it being in the minor mode, so the third scale degree is lower. And we also have the curious case of scale degrees 6 and 7. Remember that they can show up in both a raised and a lowered position. So our primary triads in the minor mode are, just like the major mode, the tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic. So a TPDT progression in minor using only primary triads sounds like this. And you'll remember from some of my other videos how I talk about the dominant function chord requires the raising of scale degree 7, the raising of the leading tone. In all other functions, the leading tone and scale degree 6 stay in their lowered position. So you would have heard that my dominant would have contained that raised 7th scale degree, the leading tone. Now, just as we did in the major mode, we can take that dominant function chord, that dominant triad, and resolve it deceptively to a submediant, a 6th chord. And that sounds like this. Tonic, subdominant, dominant, submediant. Another deceptive resolution, which then we can use to move back into the predominant area and cycle through again. The same substitutions exist in the minor mode. So for the dominant chord, I can substitute a leading tone triad. This would be the 7 chord built on the raised 7th scale degree, and that would sound like this. Tonic, subdominant, leading tone, tonic. The substitutions in the predominant area are likewise identical to the ones in the major mode. We can include the 6th chord, the submediant triad, and the 2 chord, the supertonic triad, which in this case, in the minor mode, is a diminished triad. Just as we can in the major mode, we can move through each harmonic area as long as we're moving down by third rather than up by third. So if I start on my tonic triad, and I move to my submediant in the predominant area, and then I move to my subdominant, still in the predominant area, and then I move to my supertonic, still in the predominant area, and then I can move to my leading tone triad, now in the dominant area, and then I'm going to move down to the dominant triad, which can then resolve out to the tonic triad. Now I hope you're recognizing the types of sounds that go into these progressions, that they sound familiar and they sound correct. Use your ear to help guide you through these progressions. Now let's talk about that mediant triad. Just as in the major mode, the mediant triad is somewhat rare, though not as rare as what we see in the major mode. Typically, the mediant triad will result in some sort of tonicization or temporary shifting of the tonal center to what we call the relative major. It is preceded, typically, by the subtonic triad. That's a 7 chord that's not really acting as a dominant, but maybe we can think about it as acting as a dominant to the 3 chord. So typically, we would hear this again as a circle of fifths progression. Tonic, subdominant, subtonic, here's that 7 chord without the raised leading tone, to the mediant, to the submediant, to the supertonic, to the dominant, which now uses the raised leading tone because it's a true dominant function chord, which then resolves us back home to tonic. So notice how this chart looks a lot like the chart from the major mode with one extra chord, and that is the major subtonic, the 7 chord built on the lowered 7th scale degree. So we can memorize these things pretty easily simply by screenshotting the 2 completed charts and just memorizing the motions that are available to us. There's another way that we can think about harmonic progression that might help us if we don't have access to those charts, and it has to do with root motion. When I'm talking about root motion, I'm talking about the root of the chord and then the root of the subsequent chord. And there's really 3 possibilities. We have roots that are a second away from each other, a third away from each other, and we have roots that are a fourth away from each other. Now you're probably wondering, what about roots that are a fifth away from each other? Well, you'll remember that fourths and fifths are inverses of each other. So 2 chords that are a fifth away from each other are a fourth away from each other in the opposite direction. Root motion by sixth is actually root motion by third in the opposite direction, and root motion by seventh is actually root motion by second in the opposite direction. Root motion by octave is not motion at all. We haven't changed chord roots. So by keeping track of the root motion and the direction of that motion, we can make some general statements about which types of root motions are acceptable in standard tonal harmonic progression. Let's start by dealing with root motion by second. In general, anytime you want to move up by second, that is chord roots with consecutive letter names, as long as they're moving up, that's acceptable. So we could go from a 1 chord to a 2 chord to a 3 chord, I'll let you write it in this context, to a 4 chord, to a 5 chord, and that's probably good enough. That's a dominant, so let's take it home to tonic. All of those motions by ascending second sounded pretty good. Root motion by descending second, however, is generally avoided. There's really only 2 contexts in which we typically see it in tonal music. That is, if we're moving from a tonic chord to a leading tone triad from the 1 to the 7, which then typically moves right back up to 1, or if we're moving from the submediant to the dominant chord, the 6 to the 5. And that might sound something like this. And that works because we have a strong predominant sound with the submediant moving to a strong dominant sound with the dominant, which then resolves out to the tonic. Other instances of root motion down by second just don't work all that well. So listen to this. This is my tonic chord. I'm going to move to my leading tone triad, now to my submediant, now to my dominant, this one's legal, now to my subdominant, and now to my mediant. You might be saying this sounds okay, but it breaks one of the fundamental rules of harmonic progression. And I haven't mentioned this one yet, but this one is very important. In the TPDT progression, we're always moving from left to right. Predominant chords move to dominant chords. If we move back the other direction, it's called a retrogression, and that's generally avoided. So where we had a 5 chord moving to a 4 chord, that was a retrogression. Now, it probably didn't sound terrible to your ears, because it's fairly common for that to happen in commercial music and rock and roll music. But in traditional harmonic practice, common practice tonality, that's something that is generally avoided. So, let's summarize. Root motion by second up, generally acceptable. Root motion by second down, generally not acceptable unless we're talking about tonic to leading tone or submedian to dominant. Let's talk about root motion by third. I've already mentioned this once. Root motion by ascending third is generally avoided because it doesn't sound like we're progressing. It sounds like we're just changing colors within the same chord. So for example, I have a tonic chord, and I move to my median chord, my 3 chord, which then moves to my 5 chord, which sounds like this, which then moves to my 7 chord, which sounds like this, which then moves to my 2 chord, which that's a retrogression. I hope what you're hearing here is that the chords kind of are just floating from one color to the next without really pointing us towards that harmonic goal. And that's really what harmonic progression is all about, hearing that harmonic goal and moving towards it. Root motion by descending third is generally acceptable in all contexts. We've already seen that with our typical substitutions. We move left through right through our chord charts, and then we can move down through any of the individual harmonic functions, because it sounds like we are progressing towards a harmonic goal. Finally, let's talk about root motion by fourth. Root motion by fourth is generally acceptable in either direction as long as we're not retrogressing or moving from a dominant function chord back to a predominant function chord. We generally avoid that at all costs. So it doesn't matter which direction we want to go. 1 to 4, that's root motion up by fourth. And then we can move back the other direction, go down by fourth, back to 1. Or we can go the other way, 1 to 5, down by fourth, and then come right back the other direction, back to 1. So if you remember, root motion by second, generally only written ascending. Root motion by third, generally only written descending. And then root motion by fourth, in either direction as long as we don't retrogress, go from a dominant function back to a predominant function. One more thing to remember, if you're sitting on a tonic chord, you can go anywhere. So the rules for root motion get suspended if you're starting from a tonic chord. Musicians aren't in complete agreement about these rules for harmonic progression. And that's kind of the fun of it. As musical styles change, these rules for harmonic progression can change. Many of the progressions that I played that I said are illegal in common practice tonal harmony, at least in the traditional sense, are things that you've probably heard fairly commonly in film scores, in popular music, in commercial music, but they're things that just don't show up in Western art music when this tradition was being created. Remember that music theory class is not so much about creativity, it's about craftsmanship, being able to do things in ways that will create answers that will sound correct. So for now, stick to using the chord charts. Later on, when you start doing exercises geared towards creativity, then you can start to use the median triad and retrogressions and all those other things as long as you do it intentionally and you make it sound good. Well, that does it for this video. As always, please like it. Feel free to leave constructive comments below, and to stay up on the latest music theory bites as they become available, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Until next time.